Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about what happened yesterday. I was very sick yesterday and really didn't watch this event, uh, laying down in bed, but this is what occurred, this history making event, the coronation of King Charles III. King Charles III, of course, has been unofficially king since September of last year when his mother, the longest reigning monarch in British history, Queen Elizabeth II, passed away. And finally, he got crowned in his official ceremony. This has been the first, um, the second coronation that has been broadcast all over the world on live TV, and the first ever coronation in British history that has been, hey Lisa, that has been broadcast on obviously places like YouTube, places like social media. Social media, of course, in 1953, when Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, didn't exist. So, this is the first time people from my generation have ever witnessed a coronation. And on the day it happened, unfortunately, me that is a huge history buff, especially about British history, I've always been somewhat of an Anglophile. When I was younger and I watched the movie King Ralph, I was kind of fascinated by uh, the British monarchy because usually when we were kids and we heard about monarchies, I didn't get to witness it because I was sick in bed. But usually when we hear about monarchies, we hear about them in terms of like old school, like the Middle Ages or fairy tales. We don't really hear about them in practical terms. But the British monarchy is one of the only few monarchies that exist in the modern world and is real. So when I watched that movie back in the day, I was always fascinated by the fact that a monarchy, a real life monarchy, a real life king and queen could exist in our days and times. But of course, the last one happened in 1953. I wasn't alive. So this was historic for people of my generation because we grown up with Queen Elizabeth. We grown up her as this towering uh, cultural figure. Me in the United States, secondary, removed from it. But I can imagine my friends in the UK how they reacted. And of course, King Charles is not the most popular person because he went through a lot of his personal problems in the 1990s when it came to his beloved ex wife, Princess Diana of Wales, or Diana Spencer, the late Princess Diana, who was beloved by the British people and who was called the People's Princess, and even was beloved here in the United States when she visited here in New York in the 1980s. That Children's AIDS Hospital. We have a video on it on The Crown. And many people would have loved to have seen her as the queen, as his royal consort. But unfortunately, not only did she, yeah, she should have been queen, Lisa says. And I agree, but unfortunately, she passed away in 1997. And even before she passed away, they were already divorced. They went through a very public divorce, a lot of infidelities. Some accuse her of infidelities. Of course, his infidelities, his cheating was well known and well documented. And that made the British public really not like King Charles. So, whereas the king and queen, the monarchy of Britain was held in high esteem within British society prior uh, to Queen Elizabeth's death. I'm wondering now in the future, will that office hold the same esteem? Will they have the same admiration and the same kind of respect for it the way they've had in the past? Or will it kind of be looked at as an afterthought? We've seen the struggles that they've gone through. We've seen how they treated Princess Diana, how they ostracized her, and how they made her look like a really bad person and ran her name through the mud even before she passed away. We've seen how they treated Fergie. We saw how they treated Meghan Markle. So it's different now with media, with television, and then again, social media. It's not held in the same kind of respect. A lot has changed. And because they they see Charles and they see uh, Queen Camilla in the way that they see her, and like Lisa's indicating, they don't really like her and they don't really fuck with her like that. Will it be the same thing? You, you know, when he now that he's king, will they still have a largely negative opinion about him, not just within Britain itself, within England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but within the Commonwealth nations? There's petitions now for countries like Jamaica, and we've seen it with Barbados a couple of years ago. We have a video on it where Barbados and now Jamaica trying to draw away from uh, the Commonwealth of Nations that was established with the Balfour Declaration of 1926, where the king and queen, the monarch of Britain, becomes the head of the Commonwealth of Nations, giving them some sort of autonomy more than just being colonies. So, with even within the colonies, will they be looked at differently? Now, of course, we have a different opinion of imperialism. We have a different opinion of that sort of thing after post World War II, when these nations became awakened and these nations became more conscious of their own history and started to look at even within the physical crown itself, the negativity within it. A lot of the jewels from the crown were stolen from other nations, stolen from India, stolen from places in Africa. And we saw that expressed on social media by former British subjects, people that were belonged to countries that were formerly part of the British Empire, say, hey, listen, pointing to their history, the crown that's being put on his head, it consists of stolen jewels from our country, stolen resources from our country, and we deserve reparations. So just as there's a reparations movement and a reevaluation of American history, so too there's a reevaluation of British history and the history of the British monarchy in black and brown countries around the world, which only makes sense in my mind because, I mean, let's face it, even though we held it in high esteem and there was a certain mystique about it, it didn't become in high esteem and it didn't become powerful. Nations never become powerful without exploiting the resources and the people, sometimes, especially with slavery, of other nations. Britain didn't become powerful on its own. Obviously, it became powerful off the backs of many of its subjects that were people of color. I mean, that's just a fact. And I think with the way that Queen Elizabeth was diplomatic about it and the way that she was able to assuage those people. We saw how she would in the Crown, in the series, Netflix series, The Crown. She would go to countries like South Africa, go to countries like uh, Kenya, go to countries like India, go to countries like Pakistan that were part of the British Empire, and she was able to speak to them well, and they held her in higher esteem and they held her in high regard. Some other nations, other those nations might not hold King Charles in the same way. They might not look at him in the same way because they might not respect him as much. You know what I mean? He might not command the same respect and the same love and the same admiration because he didn't have to make the sacrifices that his mother had to make. Keep in mind, his mother was she wasn't queen at the time of World War II, but she was a princess at the time of World War II, and that was a very trying time. And her charisma and her enigmatic and positive personality was able to pull her country together in times of great crisis. Not only during World War II, but also when she was queen and the country started to diminish in power and started to be overshadowed by countries like the Soviet Union and the United States. And also during COVID, her last act of courage was her ability to pull her nation together um, during the crisis of 2020 with COVID. So, will what kind of challenges will King Charles be faced with, and will King Charles be able to demand that same sort of admiration and that same sort of love by the people within Britain as well as those within the English speaking world? I don't know, because he presides over a kingdom and a country that is much more diminished in power than what it was when his mother, like I said, when his mother ascended to power in 1953. Britain was still Britain. The phrase "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was applicable during those times. It was starting to become less powerful, but it was still at its it wasn't at its apex, but it was it still demanded power and respect on the world stage. Not so much anymore. Um, as it stands right now in 2023, Britain is still a powerful nation and still a Western nation and still a modern nation, but it is not the most powerful nation on earth. The United States has surpassed it in power and influence. And that's just a reality. And China, which is up and coming, seems to going to surpass it as well. It's much like France. So in a lot of ways, the office of the king is much more diminished in power. Just as the kingdom is diminished in power, so too is the office of king. So is he going to just be a lame duck king that is not really going to do much? Or is he going to make his impact upon history? And it'll come with tragedy, just like with other leaders of other nations. What makes leaders great? Those leaders of nations that we remember throughout history are those leaders of nations whose leadership was tested, whose resolve was tested in times of crisis. Queen Elizabeth was. Queen Elizabeth had many challenges when she came in, and she faced those challenges head on. What challenges will King Charles have that will try his nation? One of the things that they talked about in this article that I read was that his coronation brought the country of England together. Because remember, Great Britain, of which England is a part of. Remember, Great Britain, United Kingdom consists of four different countries, and England is the main country. England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Um, the country of Britain has experienced a lot of um, tumultuous times within the last 8 or so years, leaving the European Union. Theresa May, who was the prime minister, resigning. Boris Johnson being kicked out of the office of prime ministership in disgrace. And of course, Queen Elizabeth and COVID and Queen Elizabeth passing away. So already he comes into a situation that is already a tumultuous situation, already a divisive situation. Britain, along with the rest of and dealing with immigration and cultural change, as Islam in Britain is on the ascendancy. Um, some terrorist attacks, of course, Not as big as the one in 2005, the 7/7 bombings, but some terrorist attack and cultural change and a lot of um, racial divisive politics, like the rest of the Western world is going through. Britain, being part of the Western world, is going through that as well. And they said that this coronation was one of the things that actually was pulling the country together and was the kind of unifier that the country needed. So that was a plus. You know, that was that was one of the good that was one of the good things, at least, about his coronation. I was telling Lisa that we don't in the United States, we have divisive politics as well, and we've kind of always had them. You know, People say, "Oh, there's increasing polarization um, in the United States or in the Western world in general," but there kind of always was. But one thing that is different about a country like Great Britain and a country like the United States is that we don't have traditions going that far back that are unifying traditions. We don't have um, we don't have a king and a queen. We don't have traditions that go back 5, 6, 700 years. Our country doesn't even go back that far. Our cultural to the only cultural tradition, as Lisa pointed out, that we really do have is food and Thanksgiving, which is a uniquely American holiday. But even that is not um, as much of a unifier. People even dispute the validity of Thanksgiving and the validity of uniquely American institutions like the NFL or American football. I mean, every time Thanksgiving comes around, we continuously have that debate about what were the motives of the pilgrims. Were they anti-indigenous motives and the exploitation of American people, the American Indians slash Native Americans that happened subsequently? So even that is not much of a unifier. There's really nothing that happens within American culture that everyone watches unless it's some kind of big tragedy like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. In times of tragedy, yeah, we've come together in American history, but most of the time, there's nothing that really pulls us together in that same sort of way. So I think there is a kind of righteous envy when it comes to uh, when it comes to us as Americans with England, because we kind of wish, in a sense, that we had something like that, some kind of cultural unifier like that, some kind of um, uh, touchstone. We don't. We don't have monuments that date back to the Middle Ages. We don't have ancient monuments like Stonehenge. We don't have medieval churches like Westminster, medieval religious institutions like Westminster Abbey or the Church of Canterbury. We don't have such things like this. We are a modern nation that emerged in modern times. And there are many nations that emerge. There are many countries that emerge as official nation states within modern times. But even those countries that emerge in those modern times have national lineages that date all the way back to medieval times or all the way back to ancient times. For example, um, Israel. Even though Israel emerged in modern times, they still have cultural traditions that date all the way back to biblical times, which we don't have as a nation. They still have holidays that unify them and cultural touchstones and they unify them. So when it comes to the English speaking world, I do think Lisa disagree with me on this, but I do think that the United States is kind of envious in a sense with that. But hey, we have Hollywood celebrities and they have monarchs and royals. So I guess they're kind of similar. Uh, but as we know, there was a time in British history in the 17th century when religious fanatics and people that were anti royalist parliamentarians that were led by the Puritan party of Oliver Cromwell did take over the country of Britain. It was for a time a republic, but um, he desired to throw out monarchies and he desired to throw out absolute rule of monarchies, but he himself installed himself as a puppet dictator. His nickname was Old Ironside, and that lasted for a couple of decades, and then they were thrown out, and King Charles II was reinstated, and he brought the crown back, and it has existed ever since. The official house that King Charles III is a part of is the House of Windsor, which has been their name since 1917. Originally, their original name was a German name, Saxe and Kosberg, but due to anti-German sediment during World War One, of course, England was um, going against Germany as part of the Allied powers, and Germany was part of the Central Powers. During World War One, there was anti-German feelings within the country, so they changed their name from the German-sounding Saxon Coburg name to the House of Windsor, named after the castle in which they live. So the country's lineage actually goes all the way back to Germany, of course, because Queen Victoria was married to a German prince, Prince Albert, and there were a lot of German institutions that were absorbed via osmosis, like the Christmas tree, into the English speaking world. But I always found that interesting that they were able to save their monarchy at a time when monarchies were being disposed of, especially 1917. We all know what famous monarchy was disposed of in Europe in 1917, the Russian monarchy, the Romanov House of Russia, and the Bolsheviks took power. It was a really anti-monarchical time, and that could have happened to England as well, like it happened to them in the 17th century, and it could have been disposed permanently. I mean, look, France never got their monarchy back. Russia never got their monarchy back either. But through a sleight of hand and through political manipulations and through changing their name, they were able to maintain it. You know what I mean? That was interesting. You know, they have German roots, but they covered up those German roots in order to preserve their dignity and preserve their position within the British public. You know what I mean? But look, in the anti-colonial mindset of the people now, and with the changing demographics of the country of Great Britain, will that still be the case? They may be looked at now as pariahs just for being imperial perpetrators. In the same way, they're not in a different way. They're not looked at pariahs anymore because they have German ancestry. Now they're looked at as pariahs because they're white, or they're remnant of colonialism and imperialism and racism and slavery. And that might want to lead the British public to either not get rid of them officially, because like I said, they have a cultural adhesiveness that brings the public together, but in a sense try to disregard them or downplay their importance in the culture, and move towards not republicanism officially, but republicanism in all but name only. Kind of like other European monarchs. Spain still has a monarchy. The Netherlands, I believe, still has a monarchy. Norway still has a monarchy. Other European countries still have monarchies, but we don't hear much about them as much as we do the House of Windsor and the British monarchy. because of the importance that the British public gives to them. So if the British public and the former British colonies stop giving them importance, will they stop being important? Who knows? Know what the future holds. And will King Charles be charismatic enough to save that? Because the king at the time in 1917 was charismatic enough to save it, and charismatic enough to make that move and to endear himself to the British public so they don't get disposed in the way that the Russian monarchy did at the time. And the same thing with his predecessor, his name predecessor, King Charles II. He was smart enough and he was crafty enough uh, to uh, to maneuver the monarchy back into the public. Say, listen, you didn't have the monarchy for these number of years. Look what happened to the country. You need the monarchy back. They they came calling back, and again, when King James II in the 1690s came in from France and tried to reinstall Catholicism, we talked about the war between the kingdoms in the St. Patrick's Day video, and he tried to reinstall the Catholic religion again for the second time. Uh, William King William came in. Uh, the reign of William and Mary came in from the Netherlands, and he then defeated King James II, and he became the king. So there have been a number. There have been a number of times in British history that the British monarchy almost, vanished from the earth, but through the craftiness of the leader, was able to preserve itself, and it still exists to this day. It's one of the oldest contiguous monarchies in the world. So what does the future hold? What does the 20th first century hold for the office of king, uh, the king of Great Britain, the monarchy of Great Britain, the king of England? We got to see. But it's been through its challenges, it's been through its ups and downs, its peaks and valleys, if you will. In the minds of the British public. Hell, even in 1066, when William the Conqueror, who was really considered the first king, I know in English history, King Alfred the Great, in the ninth century, was considered the first king of the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons, of course, are the Germanic tribe that invaded Britain after the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476. Officially, it was two twins, Herger and Hengist, two twins from a part of Germany that crossed over and invaded the British Isles and established the Saxon kings, which lasted from King Alfred I to King Edward the Confessor, and that was in the 950s, from the 950s to 1066. And from there, William the Conqueror came in from Normandy, which is a part of France today, and established the line today that exists. That basically, in British history, has traced um, its lineage from. So that was the first time in British. Well, what I think of it, I thought it was kind of boring and weird in a way because I've never seen a coronation. I watched, like I said, I was sick, so I didn't watch the whole thing. Kind of laying in bed sleeping. I'm supposed to go visit a friend, but that fell through for various reasons. because uh, I didn't really watch it, Lisa. But one of the things that really caught my eye was the passing around of the crown numerous times. Like it was passing from hand to hand and hand to hand. And I think it passed around like 4 or 5 times. I think it was supposed to symbolize succession, supposed to symbolize uh, the various successions that the crown is going through over the years. The history of the British crown and the British monarchy is very interesting, like I said. And since I've never seen one, only heard about it. I heard about it for the first time when I watched the movie The Crown. you know, and I've never seen any coronation really because I mean I know Mohammed bin Salman became king of Saudi Arabia, but I didn't see his coronation either. So with this coronation, uh, I'm like, damn, they're passing around the crown mad time. Why so many times? Uh, it was just strange and just really surreal and really weird. Like, and that crown is hella heavy. I mean, I know the saying exists, heavy is the head that wears the crown, but I mean, uh, this is literal. This is a heavy ass crown, and I'm sure he's not going to be walking around with it a lot. And another thing that caught my eye really was how much he really resembles his mom. You really didn't see it. You really didn't see the physical resemblance as much when he was a lot younger, but now that he's older, I mean, he's been preparing for this. This man is, you can really see it. This man has really been preparing for this moment since he was 7 or 8 years old. Imagine being a little young kid, being a little young boy, and playing as little young, rambunctiously, precociously, as little young boys are to do, little kids in general. One day, you have to pay attention heavily because this is all going to be yours. You're going to have to do this shit when you get older. And you've waited and you've waited and you've waited. And obviously, his mother's life was very long. She was the longest reigning monarch in British history. So he's waiting and 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 he's waiting. And finally, he's in his 70s. And it happens, and the man himself might not have long to live. You know what I mean? So it's like you never really know how long you have, so you want to enjoy it while it lasts. But at the same time, you've waited for this your whole life. You've been preparing for this your whole life. You've been waiting for this. This is the moment that has finally arrived. And it's probably bittersweet because, I mean, who really wants their mom to pass away? You know what I mean? But at the same time, you want to be king. That's sort of like Simba in The Lion King. I, I used to always joke when I would hear that Simba's song from the 1994 Lion King movie. Uh, I just can't wait to be king. And I used to be like, that's like Prince Charles. Prince Charles says that. He just can't wait to be king because he's been waiting forever. You know what I mean? And it's finally happened. You know? And it'd be interesting, of course, royal protocol, they're not going to they're not going to say, you know, he's not going to be interviewed and asked, well, how do you feel? Uh, Lisa says, in regards to racism in the UK, what do I think of them having a black choir there? I think you have to you have to represent different aspects. It's better than anything the United States would have did. I mean, the United States probably they would have had some kind of R&B singer nowadays, but you know, if the United States had royalty, it wouldn't include anything that has to do with people of color. So I think Britain is trying to heal the wounds of racism, Lisa. and trying to kind of assuage minorities and people of color in the country. So having a black choir is a step in the right direction. And another thing that is a step in the right direction is I've heard that Prince Charles is thinking about enacting or going to the British Parliament to enact some sort of laws with regards to reparations with the Caribbean countries, which would be cool because that's a discussion that I really haven't heard in regards to Great Britain. And that would then prompt other European countries and the United States to probably consider reparations. Because if Britain does it, then France will be embarrassed to not want to do it. The United States would be embarrassed to not want to do it. Spain would be embarrassed to not want to do it. And the Netherlands and all other countries, basically, at least in the West, that engaged in slavery and racism and imperialism and colonization. So if somehow Charles is able to enact those sort of reforms, kind of more important than the reform to call Queen Camilla Queen, which is another reform. They would usually refer to the spouse of the monarch as just the royal consort, like they did the late Prince Philip. But now they're calling her Queen, which the British public is, of course, up in arms about because they wanted Diana and they love Diana and they're partisan towards Diana. But this kind of reform, this kind of repairment, rapprochement, if you will, to use a French phrase, with England and its former colonies uh, and its public of color, more symbolic than just having the choir. What else can they do to um, try and heal those wounds with England and its former colonies, especially in the West Indies? Victims of the transatlantic slave trade. If he does this, this could be a step in the right direction that would encourage other white countries to do that with their former colonies in the New World, and especially in the New World, victims of slavery. So yeah, I think uh, it's kind of a symbolic gesture, but a good one. Because believe me, if Britain does something like this first, the United States will be compelled to do it. Because otherwise, the reparations talk within the United States and with regards to African Americans is futile because the U.S. doesn't want to budge on this. We had this whole discussion in 2019. Cory Booker going in front of Congress and arguing his case on behalf of reparations, and nothing has happened. So if Britain does it with regards to the former colonies in the Caribbean, maybe something will happen with regards to the United States. Because remember, Britain abolished slavery first. They were the first to abolish slavery in the 1830s, and 30 years later, the United States did it. I mean, granted, we had to have a civil war over the issue, and Britain did not. And Britain even abolished slavery within England itself with the Somerset case in the 1770s. You know what I mean? So Britain, um, Britain has always kind of been ahead of the curve on this kind of stuff. I mean, not that they've been perfect; they've had their problems also, but they've kind of done it first, and other countries were compelled to do it because they did in the 1830s. And granted, some will say, well, they reinvented slavery with Indian indenture labor, which is something we talked about, especially in regards to Trinidad, uh, Trinidad and Guyana, those two Caribbean countries where the British imported mass amounts of people from India, like the modern day nations of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh to Trinidad and Guyana as virtual slaves, as indentureships, under debt servitude. But they did abolish slavery first, and then of course compelled other countries to do it, countries in Latin America and the United States, especially those in Latin America who abolished slavery without a war. We had to have a war to do it. You know, there were other issues involved, and there were some. Britain was one of the first countries to decolonize without war. I mean, they had an ideological struggle in the 1940s in India with Gandhi and with uh, Muhammad Ali Jinnah in Pakistan, but they didn't have to go to war with those countries like France did. France went to war in Algeria. Portugal went to war in Angola to get free. Britain didn't have to go to war. In fact, the only country in British history that ever achieved independence through physical struggle was us in the United States. Other countries were let go of freely. Malaysia was let go of freely. India was let go of freely. The British mandates in the Middle East that they acquired after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in uh, at the end of World War One were let go of freely. Of course, there was bloodshed involved. The countries in the Caribbean, of course, they remained in the Commonwealth, but they were given independence and sovereignty within the 60s and 70s. So Britain never really had armed struggle with their former colonies except for us. So they kind of led the way in decolonization as well, especially compared to, like I said, France and Portugal. And France, especially because France was always there. France has always been the political and cultural rival of Great Britain. I mean, they fought each other in the Hundred Years' War, and even after the Hundred Years' War, they continued to fight each other. French and Indian War, which was the 7 Years' War in the 1750s. Um, Even in World War One, they split up the spoils of war in the Middle East with each other semi-amicably, but they've always been friends. They were allies during World War One. They were allies during World War Two, obviously for obvious reasons. But they've always been rivals and they've always been allies. And Britain has always been seen as the more, uh, in some ways, the more liberal and forward-thinking of the two. But in some ways, France has always been seen as the more liberal and forward-thinking of the two. France abolished its monarchy and never brought it back after the French Revolution of the 1790s, whereas Britain abolished its monarchy, like I said before, and brought it back. So if Britain takes this step in the right direction, other European countries, especially France, France is having its own political issues right now. There's a lot of protests against certain reforms that the French president Emmanuel Macron is doing, and of course, thoughts of debates about immigration, debates about assimilation, especially of Muslim immigrants from former colonies in North Africa that are coming in. So if Britain does this, maybe other countries, maybe France will do it. Maybe Lisa's saying President Biden didn't go to the inauguration. I mean, the coronation. Sorry. See, the American mindset: inauguration instead of coronation. Um, uh, but his wife did, and his daughter, I believe, right? And no president ever has. Lisa and I just found that out today. No president ever has gone to an inauguration, which I found surprising, but not really, because there was for a long time. Oh, cousin. Okay, there was for a long time an anti-monarchical feeling about in America because America's founding fathers were anti-monarchy. Initially, of course, the American Revolution was pushing for representation of the colonies, the 13 British colonies um, in America. They were pushing for representation because they were being taxed. They were being made to fit the bill, as it were, for the French and Indian War, which during that was the war during which Britain acquired Canada. Canada became part of the British Empire and switched hands from France to Britain during that war. And it was the American colonists, of course, being on this side of the world, being on this in the Western Hemisphere, fighting, doing most of the fighting. And then when Britain had to pay the bills and they had to pay their debts for the war, they put the bills on the American colonies and they increased taxation. We know about the Tea Act, we know about the Stamp Act, and all that. And the Americans were saying, listen, if we're going to pay for this, we're going to pay for this war, we're going to pay extra taxes, we want representation in London. That's where the phrase comes from, no taxation without representation. But then over time, you had American revolutionaries like Thomas Paine, for example, putting out these his pamphlets, his successful pamphlet that was proliferated throughout the colonies, especially in New England, in Massachusetts, like Common Sense. That was just promoting the idea like, what if we just not only got representation in Parliament and not only got representation in London, but what if we did away with this whole idea of monarchy? What if we got rid of monarchy, got rid of this whole formality, and just created a republican, a democratic republic, harkening back to, of course, the republic of using the republic of ancient Rome as a model. The founding fathers were they had a bad taste in their mouth with regards to monarchy, and they were in love with the Romans, who themselves, the Romans themselves, prior to Julius Caesar, um, with doing the takeover that he did, they also had a bad taste in their mouth for kings and queens. They also hated kings and queens. They also despised absolutist rule, and the colonists took their cues from the Roman attitude towards monarchy and towards kings and queens, and they got to not like it either. So the early days of the American Republic, I can't see them visiting any coronation. In the latter days, probably not either, because America has always, after independence, America has always been insular. Has always been into itself. It's often said when it comes to America that we don't really know anything or grasp anything about geography unless we're in a war with a certain country, and then we get to know about their geography. That's how we got to know about the geography and the history of countries like Vietnam or countries like Afghanistan that were really remote to us. So I can't imagine us wanting to be engaged in their ceremonies before that. So I believe that's true that that no president has ever been to a coronation. And of course, the modern presidents wouldn't have either, those post World War II presidents, because there was no coronation. But Queen Elizabeth was queen from 1953 until she just, this was the first one in modern history. So that's crazy. No president has ever been to one, and Biden continued that trend because he said he had something else better to do, which I think is probably bullshit and probably just an excuse. He probably just didn't want to go because it's probably boring, But I think President Obama probably would have went, or maybe President Trump. Well, Trump didn't really get it. Trump's mother actually. Trump has a connection, a more stronger connection with Great Britain because remember Trump's mother is Scottish, and Scotland, of course, is part of Great Britain, and so basically Trump's mother was a British subject. So maybe Trump through his ancestry, his mother's ancestry would have would have had maybe more respect for it, but probably not because when he met with Queen Elizabeth, she didn't get along with him because he stepped in front of her. So, but yeah, and another president who has a connection to the British crown was President Obama. President Obama's father, born Barack Obama Sr., was born in Kenya, and at that time, Kenya was part of the British Empire as well. So both the mother of Donald Trump and the father of Barack Obama were born as British subjects. Yep. Lisa says the Queen liked Obama over Trump. I think, yeah, Queen Elizabeth was always, even though it's royal protocol as per the various reforms, guys, like we talked about, the power of the British, the political power of the British monarchy was diminished over the years, starting in 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta under King John the First, after his brother King Richard the First died fighting crusade over in the Middle East. Um, he then took over, and the English barons at that time demanded more power, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, and that was the first step in diminishing the power of the office of king, or the office of the monarch. And Queen Elizabeth never took political stances because she wasn't allowed to take political stances. But according to political sides and conservative versus liberal, or left versus right, or as we would call it in America, Republican or Democrat. But she always seemed to be, according to the movie The Crown, in her famous arguments with the conservative prime minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, um, she always seemed to be more liberal minded, and more towards, you know, have more of a liberal bent in her disposition than uh, than towards a conservative. Her and Margaret Thatcher famously did not get along. They disagreed on many things. Even though she grew up in a position, she being Queen Elizabeth grew up in a position of privilege as a royal family member, and Margaret Thatcher grew up poor. Her father was a grocer, and she grew to be very conservative, highly conservative. One of those British politicians that led a lot of reforms towards the right wing during the 1980s, and a lot of cutting back of a lot of the social programs that have been instituted, by famous British prime ministers like Clement Attlee. Kind of a right wing revolution, a Reagan revolution of their own in Britain. Kind of resurrecting the conservative side of the aisle, the Tories, what we would recognize as the British version of Republicans, basically. She was the champion of them, and she was famously not anti monarchy because obviously she's a conservative, she's a traditionalist. She had high respect for the office of queen, but she didn't necessarily agree with Queen Elizabeth on a lot of political issues. So Queen Elizabeth didn't take political stances, but she was always she had, of course, being a human being, you have political you can't take political stances publicly because it's anti-royal protocol, but you can express political opinions to your prime minister. And she often expressed those political opinions, especially when it came to uh, England's support of embargo. She supported the embargoes and the trade restrictions on South Africa, and she was anti the apartheid government in South Africa. And that was one of the times when she did take a stand and she did actually publicly disagree with her prime minister, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, of course, did not support sanctions against the South African regime like Ronald Reagan didn't here, because de Klerk, who was the, uh, the head of state in charge of South Africa at the time, was an ally, and an ally against communism with Thatcher and Reagan. And Thatcher did not support sanctions against South Africa, just like Reagan didn't. But Queen Elizabeth did support them, and Queen Elizabeth overruled her, Margaret Thatcher, in that political debate. So yeah, what Lisa is saying, Queen Elizabeth was more liberal, and she was more. She had a greater favoritism towards democratic and liberal presidents like JFK than she did and Barack Obama than conservative presidents and politicians like Reagan or Trump or Eisenhower or any of those. I'm not sure about King Charles. Excuse me, his political opinions where he falls in between the uh, left right wing spectrum or continuum. I don't know. He's never came out or had to come out before on a political issue like his mother did. His mother, she was very liberal. So who knows? Maybe he's very liberal as well. If it is indeed true what he's talking about with regards to reparations, then he is kind of liberal esque. He is kind of progressive in that sense. If if it is true, if he does go through with it, so yeah, Lisa's correct. She had a favoritism towards Democratic politicians in the United States and liberal politicians within her own country more than conservative ones, who she often butted heads with. The only conservative that I think she loved and she adored and she was very loyal to was, of course, Winston Churchill, because Winston Churchill was, even though he was a conservative, he led his country in World War II, which was the greatest crisis that the Western world has faced up until that point. And the leaders of World War II, whether it be Churchill, de Gaulle, um, Roosevelt, and even Stalin in his country in the Soviet Union, are well respected for a reason because they were tried and tested. They went through a lot to preserve the freedoms of this world and fight against the aggressions of the Nazis and to a lesser extent uh, Italy and Mussolini. I mean, maybe they wouldn't be considered so held in such high esteem because they had their own issues. Not to say that Churchill didn't have his issues. I mean, the Bengal famine is notorious and is very egregious, just like Roosevelt. But the point is, of all conservative politicians, that conservative prime ministers that served under her, the one that she was heavily loyal to was Winston Churchill, and she was heavily at loggerheads with Thatcher. I get the best part The best part of the miniseries, the Netflix miniseries, The Crown, is the conversations between Thatcher and Queen Elizabeth II, and how they butt heads. They really didn't like each other. Thatcher, of course, she respected the Queen. She respected the office of the Queen, but she was very opinionated herself. She was very anti-socialist, very anti-communist, very right-wing, and the Queen just wasn't. And the Queen had strong opinions, and they had strong opinions. If you've ever been in a room with two women that have strong, equally strong but opposite opinions, you know what I'm talking about. There's kind of underlying tension with women when they argue that is different than when men argue. Men tend to argue outright, and they tend to be, much more combative, but women tend to be much more catty. They'll come with a lot of sarcastic remarks towards each other. They'll come with a lot of what quips, smart, intelligent quips when they disagree with one another. And that's what they show in The Crown. They show Thatcher and Queen Elizabeth just you know going at each other. There was tension between them, and of course, because there were two women in power. One is in charge, one is, and they come from two different fundamental backgrounds. You would think that the person of privilege would favor, like Queen Elizabeth, would favor a right wing attitude, and Thatcher, coming from a proletariat background, would favor a left wing attitude. But that often isn't the case. Most people that come from working class backgrounds or poorer backgrounds, they tend to favor, they tend to have more of a right wing bent towards them, at least in the tradition, the Anglo tradition of England and the United States. Like Andrew Jackson came from humble beginnings, and he tends to have a more right wing attitude than, say, a person from a patrician background like FDR or JFK did tend to have more left wing attitudes. It's just weird. It's the opposite of what would be expected. The irony of of political positions. But yeah, Lisa is 100% right. Obama, the Queen liked Obama. The Queen didn't like Trump because Trump was like King Ralph. Trump was King Ralph. When Trump went to Buckingham Palace, Trump was King Ralph come to life. If you saw that movie King Ralph starring John Goodman in the early 90s, the one that I said got me interested in in the history of the British crown. You know what I'm talking about, guys. King Ralph was like John Goodman's character. he was crass, he was crude. The story behind it was King Ralph is a descendant of the British royal family, and all the British royal family, starring Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole was takes a picture, and the cord got wet in the royal family picture, and the entire royal family was wiped out, and there were no successors to the crown, so they had to go all the way to America to find this working class commoner, crude, American style, rude, loud, obnoxious person, descendant of the British royal family, to come to become king. And he just, and the stuff he does, like he takes a bath within the crown, falls in the tub, he marries a stripper, you know, in the middle of the night, he gets hungry, wants to go to McDonald's. That's what basically, if Trump would have became king of England, like they would have found it, okay, he's a British descendant. He would have became king of England. That's basically what he would have been in real life. John Goodman's character in that movie. Um, uh, um, he didn't really follow all the protocols and all the rules necessarily of uh, what a president, how the president is supposed to behave vis-a-vis a monarch. You know what I mean? So just funny. But anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. It'll be coming out in a couple of minutes because I want to do something on Backlash. This was the first Backlash in like 10 or 15 years in Puerto Rico, and it was a good Backlash. It was a good pay-per-view, a celebration of Puerto Rican heritage and Puerto Rican identity and Puerto Rican fandom, rabid fandom of professional wrestling in the WWE. So stay tuned for that one in the next coming minutes. Love you guys. Peace.